she promised she'd return years later. She came to his door. The promise said of it. Hartwell had always been a man of simple pleasures. His small cottage on the outskirts of Millbrook was surrounded by wildflowers he'd planted himself, a vegetable garden that provided more than he could eat, and a workshop where he crafted furniture with his own hands. At 32, he lived alone by choice, content with his books, his tools, and the occasional visit from neighbors who appreciated his quiet wisdom and generous spirit. The evening she arrived changed everything. It was a Tuesday in late September. When the knock came, David set down his wood plane and wiped his hands on his apron, wondering who would visit so late. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and golds. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. She stood there like something from a dream, tall and graceful, with silver white hair that seemed to shimmer in the porch light, and eyes the color of deep forest lakes. Her clothes were unusual, flowing and iridescent, made from fabric he'd never seen before. Despite her ethereal appearance, there was something achingly human in her expression, a vulnerability that made his heart skip. "Are you David Hartwell?" she asked, her voice carrying a musical quality that made his name sound like poetry. "I am," he replied, unable to look away from her luminous eyes. "Can I help you?" She smiled then, and it was like watching sunrise over still water. "My name is Naya. I know this will sound strange, but I need your help. More than that, I need you." David stepped back, gesturing her inside. "You look exhausted. Come in, please. I'll make some tea." As she entered his humble home, Naya seemed to brighten the space simply by being there. She moved with fluid grace, her fingers trailing over his handmade furniture with appreciation. "You made these yourself," she said, not quite a question. "I did." David filled the kettle, stealing glances at her. "What kind of help do you need?" Naya settled into his favorite chair, and for a moment she looked so weary that David wanted nothing more than to comfort her. "I'm not from here," she began carefully, "not from this world. I'm what you might call an explorer, from a place very far away." David should have laughed, should have questioned her sanity or his own. Instead, something deep inside him recognized the truth in her words. Perhaps it was the way the air seemed to shimmer around her, or how the wood grain in his table seemed to respond to her touch, growing more beautiful in her presence. "Why me?" he asked, settling across from her with two steaming mugs. "Because you have something rare," Naya said, wrapping her hands around the mug. "A heart that sees beauty in simple things, hands that create rather than destroy, and a soul that," she paused, meeting his eyes, "that calls to mine across the vastness of space." They talked through the night. Naya spoke of distant worlds, of conflicts that threatened entire galaxies, of a mission that had brought her to Earth seeking someone who could help her people survive. She spoke of ancient prophecies that spoke of humans, of their unique capacity for both creation and sacrifice. As dawn approached, Naya stood to leave. "I have to go," she said, and David felt his heart breaking for reasons he couldn't name. "Will I see you again?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them. Naya turned back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I promise you, David Hartwell, that I will return, no matter how long it takes, no matter what obstacles I face. I will come back to you." She stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart. The touch sent warmth flooding through him, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life had just been divided into two parts before Naya. And after, "Wait for me," she whispered, and then she was gone, leaving only the scent of starlight and the echo of a promise. The waiting 3 years passed like seasons in slow motion. David threw himself into his work, his hands staying busy while his heart waited. He expanded his workshop, took on larger commissions, and became known throughout the county for furniture that seemed to hold a piece of the maker's soul. But every piece he crafted, every chair and table and cabinet, was made with the same secret hope that someday Naya would sit in them, touch them, make them truly complete. The townspeople of Millbrook grew accustomed to David's quiet melancholy. Mrs. Pemberton from the general store would slip extra items into his grocery bags, with worried clucks about him wasting away. Tom Bradley, the local sheriff, would stop by with invented excuses to check on his friend's welfare. Even the children seemed to sense something different about the gentle craftsman, who had once been quicker to smile. David kept a journal, though. He'd never been much for writing before. In it, he recorded not just the mundane details of his days, but his thoughts, his dreams, and his unwavering faith that Naya would return. He wrote about the way morning light through his kitchen window reminded him of her hair, how thunderstorms made him think of her voice, how every shooting star was a message he couldn't quite decode. On quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch and study the stars, wondering which one was hers. He read books about astronomy, about physics, about the possibility of life beyond Earth. The scientific articles and theories somehow made Naya's existence feel more real, not less. If the universe was vast enough to hold billions of galaxies, surely it was vast enough to hold his love. The seasons brought their own challenges and consolations. Spring reminded him of hope, of things returning to life. Summer was warmth and growth, and the memory of that single night when everything changed. Autumn brought melancholy but also harvest, the satisfaction of work completed and preparations made. Winter was the hardest long nights and cold mornings that made him question whether he'd imagined it all, but he never truly doubted. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of a snow-covered night, he would feel her presence like a warm touch on his shoulder. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of impossible colors in the corner of his vision, or hear music that seemed to come from between the stars. These moments sustained him, fed the certainty that burned steady as a pilot light in his chest. His craftsmanship evolved. During those years of waiting, where once he had been skilled, he became masterful. Where once he had been careful, he became inspired. People began traveling from distant cities to commission pieces from the hermit craftsmen of Millbrook, drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized instantly: furniture that seemed to hold love itself in its grain. David's home changed too, slowly and unconsciously. He found himself making small improvements, not for his own comfort but for hers. A reading nook by the window where the morning light was perfect, a herb garden with plants whose names he learned in half-remembered fragments of their conversations, a wind chime made from pieces of wood and metal that sang in harmonies that reminded him of her laughter. Friends tried to set him up with local women, kind souls who saw his loneliness and wanted to heal it. David was always polite, always gentle in his refusals, but firm. He belonged to someone who traveled between stars, and no earthly love could compare to that cosmic connection. As the third year drew to a close, doubt began to creep in for the first time, not doubt in Naya herself, but doubt in his right to wait. Was he being foolish? Was he wasting his life on a promise made by someone whose very existence seemed like a beautiful dream? But then winter deepened and Christmas approached, and David found himself crafting something special: a small wooden box, inlaid with patterns that seemed to shift and flow like starlight. He didn't know why he was making it, only that his hands knew the work and his heart knew the purpose. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell soft and silent outside his windows, David placed the finished box on his mantle and whispered a prayer to whatever gods watched over lovers separated by impossible distances. The box seemed to pulse with gentle light, and David smiled for the first time in months. The return knock came on a Thursday evening in early March, 6 years and 5 months after David had last seen Naya's face. He was in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a dining table that would seat 12 when the sound reached him through the open door connecting the workshop to his house. 3 soft raps, spaced like a heartbeat. David's hands stilled on the wood, his breath catching. He'd heard thousands of knocks over the years: neighbors, customers, delivery men, but this one was different. This one sang to something deep in his chest, a recognition that bypassed thought and went straight to his soul. He set down his tools with deliberate care, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked through his house like a man approaching an altar. His fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle, and for a moment he hesitated. What if it wasn't her? What if 6 years of waiting had finally driven him to hear things that weren't there? But when he opened the door, Naya stood there like a promise kept. She was different, told her somehow, though her ageless beauty remained. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of struggles he couldn't imagine, and her silver hair now held threads of deep blue like captured starlight. Her clothes were travel-worn, and she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had fought battles and borne losses. "Hello, David," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered music and starlight and home. "You came back," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I promised I would." They stood there for a long moment, drinking in the sight of each other. David noticed a scar along her left temple, the way her hands shook slightly with exhaustion, the profound relief in her luminous eyes. Naya saw the gray threading through his brown hair, the deeper lines around his eyes, the way he'd grown leaner but stronger in their years apart. "You waited," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Every day." Naya's composure cracked then, and tears spilled down her cheeks like falling stars. David stepped forward and caught her as she swayed, pulling her into his arms with a fierce tenderness that spoke of years of aching emptiness finally filled. She was solid and warm and real, and she smelled like ozone and distant flowers and something indefinably her. David buried his face in her hair and felt the last 6 years rearrange themselves into something bearable, something that had led to this moment of perfect rightness. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," Naya whispered against his shoulder. "I wasn't sure you'd still want." "Always," David said fiercely. "Always and always and always." He led her inside, his arm around her waist as if he could anchor her to this world through touch alone. The house welcomed her back like a song welcoming its harmony. Colors seemed brighter, shadows warmer, and the very air hummed with completion. "You've been busy," Naya observed, running her fingers over a new bookshelf, a chair that hadn't existed before, a small table that held exactly the right proportions for two people sharing morning coffee. "I was making a home," David said, "for when you came back to me." They settled in his living room, Naya curled in the chair she'd claimed that first night, David across from her where he could study her face and convince himself she was real. The wooden box from his mantel seemed to pulse with gentle light, and Naya's eyes widened when she noticed it. "You made that," she said, wonder in her voice. "I don't know why, my hands just knew." Naya reached for the box with reverent fingers. When she touched it, it opened with a soft chime, revealing an interior that seemed to hold more space than should have been possible. Inside, swirling like captured aurora, were threads of light that pulsed in rhythm with both their heartbeats. "You've been learning," she said softly, even without knowing it. "You've been growing into what you were meant to become." "What am I meant to become?" Naya looked up from the box, her eyes bright with love and possibility. "My partner, my equal, my bridge between worlds." The choiceth next morning brought revelations that changed everything David thought he knew about love, destiny, and the nature of reality itself. Naya sat across from him at his kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and told him truths that should have shattered his world, but instead made it finally make sense. "The war is over," she began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "My people, the Viren, we've been fighting the Chronari Empire for 3 centuries. They wanted to harvest entire worlds, strip them of life and resources, to fuel their expansion across the galaxy." David listened in silence, his craftsman's hands steady on his own mug, offering the quiet strength she needed to continue. "We won, but at a cost that nearly destroyed us. Half our population is gone. Our home world is barely habitable. We need to rebuild, to heal, but we've forgotten how." Her eyes met his, vulnerable and desperate. "We've been warriors for so long that we've lost the ability to create, to nurture, to grow things instead of fighting them. And you think I can help with that?" David asked gently. "Not think. No." Naya reached across the table and took his hands. "That box you made, it's a Viren artifact, ancient technology that responds only to those who carry the genetic markers of the original builders. Humans, David. Humans are the descendants of the Viren who left our world millennia ago, who chose creation over conquest and seated themselves among the stars." David stared at her, processing implications that stretched his understanding to its limits. "You're saying humans are our cousins, our balance, our salvation." Naya's grip tightened on his hands. The prophecies spoke of a time when the children of exile would return to heal what war had broken. But it was never about conquest or grand gestures. It was about this one heart calling to another across impossible distance. One soul teaching another how to build instead of destroy. The weight of it should have crushed him. But David found himself thinking of all the times he'd felt different, set apart, as if he were waiting for something he couldn't name. "What are you asking me to do?" "Come with me," Naya said simply. "Help me teach my people how to live again instead of just survive. Help me rebuild a world with your hands, your heart, your human understanding of what it means to create beauty from nothing." David was quiet for a long time, studying her face, feeling the magnitude of the choice settling around him like snow. "If I go with you, can I come back?" "Yes, we have that technology now. You could travel between worlds, split your time, build bridges between our peoples." She paused, vulnerability creeping into her voice. "But I won't lie to you, David. It would be dangerous, difficult. You'd be leaving everything you know." "Would I be leaving it? Or expanding it?" Naya smiled then, the expression lighting up her entire face. "You always were wiser than you gave yourself credit for." They spent the day walking through Millbrook, David showing her the town he'd grown up in, the people he'd cared for, the life he'd built in quiet dedication. Mrs. Pemberton embarrassed him by gushing over how much happier he looked, while Sheriff Bradley sized up Naya with protective suspicion, until she helped him fix his patrol car with tools that didn't quite belong to this world. That evening, they returned to David's cottage and stood in his workshop among the furniture he'd crafted with love and patience. Naya ran her hands over each piece, her touch awakening possibilities he'd never imagined. Under her fingers, the wood seemed to sing, revealing patterns and purposes that transcended mere function. "You've been preparing for this your whole life," she said softly, "even when you didn't know it." "Have I?" "Every chair you've made with the thought that someone would find comfort in it. Every table crafted to bring people together. Every cabinet built to hold treasures safely." She turned to face him, starlight dancing in her eyes. "That's what my people need to remember, how to make things that serve love instead of war." David moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin, to catch the scent of distant flowers that always seemed to cling to her hair. "What about us, in all of this saving worlds and rebuilding civilizations? What happens to David and Naya?" "We love each other," she said, as if it were the simplest truth in any universe. "We love each other, and we build something beautiful together, and we prove that some promises are strong enough to hold across any distance." He kissed her then, finally, after 6 years of waiting and wondering and hoping. It was soft and careful and perfect, tasting of starlight and possibilities and coming home. When they broke apart, David's decision was already made, written in the way she fit against him like a missing piece finally found. The new beginning. 3 months later, David stood on the observation deck of a Viren transport ship, watching Earth grow smaller in the viewport until it became just another point of light in the vast tapestry of space. His hands still a craftsman's hands, but now steady with purpose instead of trembling with uncertainty, rested on the rail as he marveled at the beauty of the universe. From this impossible vantage point, Naya peered beside him, her presence as natural as breathing after all their years of separation and these precious months of reunion. She'd spent the time before their departure helping him settle his affairs on Earth, working with Sheriff Bradley to establish a foundation that would maintain his cottage, and workshop for the children of Millbrook to learn traditional crafts. Mrs. Pemberton had cried when they'd said goodbye, but she'd also pressed a care package into David's hands that contained enough homemade cookies to feed a small army. Having second thoughts, Naya asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "About leaving Earth, maybe a little." David turned from the viewport to face her, drinking in the sight of her face alive with excitement and possibility. "About you, never." The journey to Viren took 2 weeks in Earth time, though the ship's temporal fields made it feel like both an instant and an eternity. David spent the time learning about Viren culture, about the technology that made their healing possible, about the scope of the task ahead of them. He also spent it marveling at Naya in her element, watching her move through the ship with easy confidence, seeing her interact with her people who regarded her with deep respect and affection. The crew had been skeptical of him at first, this quiet human who claimed he could help heal their war-torn world. But gradually, as they saw the way their furniture responded to his touch, how metal and crystal seemed to sing under his hands. Their doubt transformed into something approaching awe. Viren itself took David's breath away. The planet hung in space like a wounded jewel, its surface scarred by centuries of conflict, but still beautiful beyond description. Cities of crystal and metal stretched across continents, their architecture organic and flowing, designed to work with natural forces rather than against them. But everywhere David looked, he could see the damaged buildings that had forgotten how to grow, gardens where nothing would bloom, public spaces that felt empty and sterile despite their technical magnificence. "It's beautiful," he told Naya as their shuttle descended toward the capital city. "But it's broken," she finished. "Yes, that's why we need you." The first months on Viren challenged everything David thought he knew about himself. Working with Viren artisans, he learned to shape materials that shifted like liquid light and responded to emotion as much as technique. His small cottage workshop expanded into something that could only be called a studio, then a school, then a movement. The breakthrough came when he began teaching Viren children. Adults who had spent decades focused on warfare struggled to remember how to create for joy instead of necessity. But children who had been born into peacetime but raised by traumatized parents, they absorbed David's lessons like flowers turning toward sunlight. He taught them to work with wood imported from Earth, showing them how patience and attention could transform raw material into objects of beauty and function. He showed them how to see possibility in broken things, how to repair rather than replace, how to build with love instead of mere efficiency. Gradually, the adults began to join the workshops. Naya was among his first students, her powerful hands learning gentleness as she coaxed furniture from stubborn materials. Watching her discover the joy of creation, seeing her laugh when a chair leg wobbled or smile when a joint fit perfectly, David fell in love with her all over again. Their relationship deepened in the shared work. They lived together now in a dwelling that grew from the crystal foundations of Viren architecture, but incorporated David's love of wood and natural materials. It was a home that belonged to both, their worlds beautiful in its fusion of human warmth and Viren technology. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their terrace overlooking the healing city and plan their future. They talked about the workshops they would establish, the exchange programs that would bring young Viren to Earth and human artisans to Viren. They talked about the children they hoped to have someday, hybrid beings who would carry the best of both worlds in their hearts. But mostly they talked about love, about how David's patient waiting had been matched by Naya's determined return, about how some connections transcend species and distance and time itself, about how the universe, vast as it was, had conspired to bring them together at exactly the right moment to heal exactly the right wounds. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on your door that night?" Naya asked one evening, her head pillowed on David's shoulder as they watched Viren's 3 moons rise over the crystal spires of the city. "No," David said without hesitation. "Because you did knock, you kept your promise, and now we're exactly where we were always meant to be." Years later, when David had become a master teacher whose students spanned multiple worlds, when his fusion of human craftsmanship and Viren technology had transformed entire cultures, he would still remember that first night when love knocked on his door disguised as an impossible request, and he would smile, knowing that the best promises, the ones worth waiting for, are the ones that change not just 2 hearts, but entire worlds.